Now, this programme has persistently reported allegations that Sri Lankan government forces committed serious human rights abuses at the end of the civil war in 2009. Now, we've spoken to a number of Tamils who claim that abuse is still rife. And I should just warn you, this report from our Foreign Affairs correspondent, Jonathan Miller, does contain images some people may find distressing. And there is also some flash photography.
This man heads a regime accused of war crimes and some of the worst human rights abuses of recent decades. President Mahinda Rajapaksa's government dismisses all that as preposterous. He's been on a charm offensive to repair his nation's tarnished reputation, and it's been working. The long war between government forces and Tamil Tiger separatists may have ended 2.5 years ago, but tonight Channel 4 News reveals that behind the smiles there still lies a vengeful, sadistic regime. This Tamil man claims he was tortured by the Sri Lankan security forces in June this year.
They used to beat me with a steel cable. It would peel away my skin. The pain would be simply unbearable. They would hang me upside down and dunk my head into water. They covered my head with a polythene bag soaked in petrol and tied it tightly around my neck. When I tried to breathe in, it felt like I was breathing in fire.
The Tamil Tigers stand accused of war crimes too. Suspected fighters were rounded up at the end of the war, but suspects are still being detained and tortured today. It can take years to be granted asylum in the UK. The two men I met were approved within weeks because the government accepted their stories. Both had past associations with the outlawed Tamil Tigers. Both claimed they'd been tortured in Sri Lanka this summer.
They hung me upside down and dunked my head in a barrel of water. They laid me face down on a table and hammered me with wires, poles and rods. They burned me with cigarette butts, and when I asked for water to drink, they gave me urine. I thought it would have been better if I died at the end of the war, rather than to have survived to face this.
Because we've had to disguise these men's identities and even change their voices, it's really hard to communicate just what it's like to listen to them recounting their experience of being tortured. Both men have broken down in tears. Both still experience intense pain, and both have nightmares.
Those two men are not alone. Tomorrow, a United Nations committee meets to consider mounting evidence that Sri Lanka is in breach of the UN Convention Against Torture, to which it is legally bound. Among reports submitted to this committee from 12 international organisations, the most detailed and damning is from the UK-based group Freedom from Torture, which cares for torture victims. Its Sri Lankan caseload is high. Based on forensic medical documents compiled for 35 men and women tortured, it says, since the end of Sri Lanka's civil war, the charity's report to the UN Committee Against Torture expresses grave concern. The group states that torture perpetrated by the military and the police is still occurring in 2011, that victims are left with visible, heavy scarring, evidence for all to see, suggesting perpetrators aren't even worried about getting caught. The evidence, it concludes, is sufficiently serious to merit urgent investigation.
People have had a very high concentration of torture within quite a short time frame, and they're very damaged by it, and they've got physical and psychological scars.
This year, the British government has forcibly removed an unknown number of failed Tamil asylum seekers to Sri Lanka. The UK has signed the UN Convention Against Torture, which states that no one should be deported if there are substantial grounds to believe they'd be tortured. The government bases its assessment of that risk on the UK Border Agency's Country of Origin Information reports. The latest COI report on Sri Lanka is dated July this year. Under the section on torture, it quotes international human rights groups, other governments and the UN as stating that torture's still rife in Sri Lanka. Having said all that, this report then cites a letter from a British diplomat, our man in Colombo, who writes, and I quote, "I asked the senior government intelligence officials if there was any truth in allegations that the Sri Lankan authorities were torturing suspects. They denied this was the case." Not entirely surprising. Britain does not monitor the fate of those it deports. The border agency told us it only returns those whom they're satisfied aren't at risk. In line, it says, with a European court ruling that not all Tamil asylum seekers do require protection. Human rights groups contend that failed Tamil asylum seekers are all at risk. From the evidence we've heard from those who've made it out of Sri Lanka's torture camps, the long war is not over yet.
And we have contacted the Sri Lankan government outlining the allegations detailed in Jonathan Miller's report there. They refused to give a statement to us without seeing full copies of both interviews, which we're not in a position to do.